My best friend Carl has no fingers, and no one believes him when he tells them why. These days, he tells them it's congenital. It happens. Nothing to be ashamed of. Most people just take that at face value, but every now and again, some idiot presses him for details. Like that's something they have the right to know. Did your mom smoke when she was pregnant with you? Is a ludicrously common one. Like seriously, who asks that? And when that happens, Carl will tell them the real reason. A lot of the times, he'll call me to back him up, and I always do. But no one ever believes either of us. You see, it's because Carl lost his fingers to a finger trap. Yes, all of them. Obviously, it wasn't an ordinary finger trap, and honestly, if we still had it, I'd be tempted to hand it over to the idiot who thinks it's okay to quiz disabled people about their disabilities. But we don't, because we destroyed it in order to save Carl's life. Because it wasn't going to stop with his fingers. We were 14 at the time, maybe too old to be doing dumb stuff like we did, but we also grew up in a town that the modern era had forgotten. The only people who still lived there were people who couldn't afford to leave. They ought to have renamed the whole place Poverty. Carl and I were pretty much the only two kids in the whole place. There were 5 or 6 other children, but they were all too young or too old to bother with, so it was just us when we weren't in school. That's another story for a different time. He lived at one end of town, and I lived on the other, and we'd meet in the middle most days, between vacant shops and the single gas station. As you might guess, there wasn't a lot to keep a couple of active kids busy, especially since no one could afford things like video games or cable. Carl and I had a bad habit of breaking into the abandoned buildings and exploring, messing with anything that had been left behind. We'd pretty much picked clean the carcass of every building in town. When we finally got to an old movie theater, and there was a reason, we left it for last. It was rumored to be haunted by the last owner, a man who people swear was over a century old when he finally died. They claim that the town started to die the day the old man did. They said that with his dying breath, he cursed the place that had taken everything from him. Rumor was he lost his sons in the local factory to unsafe machines and lack safety. And then, when he was in his 60s, the city decided that his old theater was an eyesore. So they passed some kind of ordinance and got it shut down. My guess is they wanted his money. He was reputed to be loaded, the only person in town that had any kind of money, even back then. The old man refused to sell the property, and though the town nickel and dimed him with fines and fees, he had enough money saved up to fend them off for the rest of his life. They said he died angry, more than 50 years later, and he wanted everyone in the town to lose everything they had too, until there was no more people and no more town. So obviously, Carl and I only hesitated for about 5 minutes after prying up the boards over the emergency exit before we went in. I brought my dad's crowbar in with us though, in case of ghosts, or stuff that looked fun to smash. Carl had the flashlight, so he led the way. We poked around the belly of a screen room for a while, and were pretty disappointed when we found out there was nothing behind the canvas screen, like we'd always had imagined there'd be. Just a blank concrete wall. Then, we ventured up to the lobby, where we realized we'd hit the jackpot. Everything was exactly where it must have been a decade ago. Thinking back, there was no way all of it had been sitting there 50 years. Some of it was way too modern to have any place in a theater that had shut down half a century before. But Carl and I weren't thinking about any of that. There was an arcade, skee-ball. We were kids and too busy losing our minds about the concession stand still stocked with ancient candy, and the games, and the prize counter to worry about the discrepancies in some stupid ghost story. While I used the crowbar to pry open a few machines, looking for quarters, and then the bottom of the skee-ball machine to get all the balls. Carl poked through the prizes behind the stand. Plastic spiders, rubber balls, stuff like that. A few stuffed animals, a couple of cheap squirt guns. Nothing really worth writing home about. I'd given up on quarters and was lobbing a few wooden orbs at the goals on the other end of the machine when I heard him laughing. I looked up and found him standing behind the counter, wearing a fluorescent orange-green finger trap on his 2 index fingers. "Look," he laughed, lifting it so I could see. I grinned, laughing with him as he tried to tug his fingers out. I can't get it off. Neither of us were panicked yet. Not then. We still thought he was just being a doofus. We didn't realize that we'd stumbled into something really, really wrong. I dropped the last skee-ball in my hand and wandered over, chortling at what I thought was his stupidity. "You're supposed to push it back in." He rolled his eyes at me and showed me as he pushed his fingers in. The plastic fabric even bowed in the middle, just too close together, like it had gotten shorter. It's probably old. I came over and helped him push. God, do I regret that. My skin still crawls thinking about it. I don't think I'll ever forgive myself. We both watched the fabric bunch together, way short of where his fingers should have been. There was no space between his 2 base knuckles. I was speechless for a whole half minute, and then I looked him in the eyes. "Dude," I whispered, "how are you doing that?" "I'm not," Carl responded, looking at me with just as much shock. I can't feel my fingers." My eyes flipped back down. I watched him jerk the fabric a few more times. That was when I realized that it had moved, jumped from the index finger to his middle fingers. The index fingers were gone. I said something. I don't remember what. I just remember that it made Carl look. And that was when he started screaming. He tried to rip his fingers out of the trap, but it just stretched out really, really thin, and then snapped back, shorter than it had been before. "It's eating my fingers," he screamed. And I remember how big all of the posters seemed at the moment. All these B-movie monsters and starlets seemed to be looming, looking down at us, mocking our horror, screaming and laughing at the same time. "Stop pulling!" I don't know why I yelled it, but Carl wasn't listening anyway. He was just frantically jamming and wiggling and pulling, and every time he did, the trap would get shorter and shorter, and then jump to the new set of fingers. I was scrambling for something, anything to help. I even tried to use the edge of the crowbar to pry it off. By the time I looked at the glass cabinet, he was down to his pinkies and thumbs, and the trap had just transferred to his thumbs. I felt the heft of the crowbar in my hand, and I just swung. It shattered into a zillion pieces. Shards flew everywhere. I got more than a few little cuts, and then one big cut when I snatched up a big shard and turned to use it on the trap. "Help me!" Carl was sobbing as I turned the edge onto the plastic. It was rubbery and thick, and cutting my palm as I sawed frantically. Faster and faster when I realized that the trap was no longer around even just his pinkies. It was up to his wrist, desperately, manically, not caring if I sawed into him. I cut. The prizes and colors of the arcade machines flashing with every push. They were active now, singing and pinging and glittering like new, despite having been coated in dust just a few seconds ago. Grotesquely cheerful chimes wailed all around us. I put everything I had into cutting through that rubber. My blood was everywhere when I finally felt something tear. I really thought it was just the plastic. I didn't find out otherwise till later. I must have been in shock. His hands came away. I helped him drag the shorn bits of plastic off, throw them to the ground, back 5 feet away, relieved and horrified at the same time when I realized he still had his palms, just no fingers. I was pulling him towards the exit, even as he was trying to shake the last bit of orange and green away, screaming this horrible, shrill scream. We were both screaming, but I didn't realize it until we got onto the street and the car started stopping. As luck would have it, Carl's dad was in one of those cars, just coming home from his job in the next town. We screamed some garbled explanation. I don't know if he believed or understood, but he took one look at his son's stumps and my bloody hands and threw up, and then threw us both in the car. He must have been going 90 miles per hour to get us to the hospital as fast as he did. The county doctors took one look at Carl, and I guess they thought we were pulling some kind of prank, until they saw me. I didn't understand why they took me back and not him, not until they were giving me stitches and asking if I had it. "What?" I remembered asking, not understanding until one nurse shook her head and said they probably wouldn't be able to reattach it anyway. That's when I looked down and realized I was missing one of my own, a finger, from my left hand. And I don't know now, but at the time, I remember thinking, that's why I let go. I gave it one of mine, so it let him go. I'm told that some people from town went to see if they could find it later. Any of them. I'm not sure why. There was nothing to be done at this point. But they did find them. 11 rubber fingers. The costume kind that you slip on and usually come with claws or green skin. These were perfectly normal though, and a perfect match for our skin tones.